Thanks, Louise. And just would acknowledge that this work that I did was, Louise was one of my supervisors, as was Janet Hook and Richard Edwards. So why should we consider food and sport? This picture was taken at the stadium, the Westpac Stadium down the road, when I was doing some of my research, and it's a picture of some sponsorship, but perhaps not the sponsorship we're talking about, but it does show you the efforts that some sponsors will go to promote their brands and their products. This is the night that they released the new All Blacks jersey, and Adidas paid for all these lovely signs. But you'll notice around the top and around the rim there are other signage, and some of those are food sponsors, so we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But sport, as I'm sure you all know, it's a major part of our lives. It's embedded in the fabric of society in New Zealand. And any week, 79% of adults and almost 60% of adolescents participate in some form of sport. 40,000 New Zealanders are employed in sport, and 500,000 people volunteer. Sport attracts wide televised audiences. So we all know that players, people participating in sport, need a healthy diet to perform at their best, and our elite athletes get this advice, and they're supported in making these choices around what is a healthy diet. But our younger players also need to eat well, yet the food that they're presented with when they're in sports settings and sort of marketing we see is often in direct contrast to those messages around healthy eating. It's usually energy-dense, nutrient-poor foods and beverages and brands that are available at sports events and that are major sponsors. Yet we don't know that much about what's actually going on, so this project was actually to look at what was happening in food and sport. So our aim was to examine the marketing and availability of food and drinks in New Zealand sports settings, and to be clear, this was non-alcoholic beverages. We didn't focus on any of the alcohol. We did this using a case study methodology. We did it in 2 phases. In the first part of the research, I spoke with 18 key informants from national and regional sports organisations. I looked at 306 sports organisations' websites, so I had to go through every single page and look for evidence of sponsorship or marketing. So it was a somewhat tedious process, I'm sure you can appreciate. In the second phase of the investigation, so we looked widely at nationally and regionally at sports organisations. At the second phase of the research, we took a detailed investigation of rugby and netball, and we chose those because they're 2 very, very popular New Zealand sports. I interviewed 37 sports administrators, so that included people who were working in rugby clubs, netball centres and regional sports organisations. I again undertook website analysis, so went through websites for netball centres, netball and rugby clubs, looked at some televised netball and rugby games, and did observations. So I actually went to 25 rugby clubs and 13 netball venues in 3 regions in New Zealand. So that was quite a lot of fun, actually. I had a lot of fun going out to sports clubs, and I had the great joy of being paid to go and see the All Blacks and the Silver Ferns play. So I went to national, regional and club levels of sport to go and collect this data. So what did we find? So in terms of the results from the sponsorship section of this research, what we found was this result where about 35% of the sponsors that we identified were bars and restaurants. So we included these as food sponsors because bars and restaurants obviously sell food. But they were by far the biggest group of sponsors we found. We found the next biggest group were the unhealthy brands and companies. And when we say brands and companies, so we had distinct brands that we could recognise, but we had companies, for example, Anchor as a company, and they were a sponsor, so we had to think about how we were going to classify those companies. We had 21% were healthy brands and companies, 15 were supermarkets, so the New World type sponsorships, and 4% were unclassified. So the unclassified sponsors were things like coffee companies, because we weren't quite sure where to put those. They didn't fit into our guidelines in either healthy or unhealthy, so we called them unclassified. In terms of deciding what companies were healthy and unhealthy, we went through all the websites of those companies and looked for every product that they had, and we analysed every product they had and said if they met the criteria for healthy, if half their products were healthy, we categorised them as healthy, and if half were unhealthy, we categorised them as unhealthy. So if we looked across by sport, what did we find? We found rugby had the most sponsors of all of the sports involved. Not only they attract more sponsors, but they attracted more of the not classified. In this slide, the not classified includes the bars and restaurants. So there was a large number of bars and restaurants, there was slightly more healthy foods and unhealthy foods in rugby. And then if you look across the remaining national and regional sports, what we found was there were relatively small numbers of food and beverage sponsors, but fair amount of unhealthy foods in amongst all of these things. So small numbers, but spread quite widely. So what's the issue with this, you might ask? When we looked a little bit more at some of these sponsorships, we found that 6 of them were supported by quite intensive marketing campaigns. And these were identified by the informants we spoke to. All of these marketing campaigns provided the sponsor with significant brand exposure, and they were associated with behaviour modification techniques. So the sponsorships included Coca-Cola as a company, but Powerade as a brand, sponsored the New Zealand national rugby team. And we see, I'm not quite sure, this photo was taken a couple of years ago, but their training gear is all sponsored by Powerade. They're also sponsored by Coke Zero, and we see the Coke Zero signage at the rugby games around some of those screens that we see along the front. If you watch coverage of the All Blacks game, what you'll see is in the dressing room, you'll see shots of a big barrel of Powerade in the dressing room, and alongside the games you'll see that the athletes have got Powerade branded bottles to drink from. So they're very clearly associating the athleticism and the success of the All Blacks with their brand. Another sponsorship we see associated with sport, this sits into our unclassified brand, was New World. New World Supermarket sponsorship of National Netball, and I think any of you are involved in netball will know you can't really go to a netball ground without seeing some New World sponsorship. They not only do they sponsor the national team and have signage across on the court, on the uniforms, around the screens, but also at netball clubs you'll find a lot of the goalpost protectors have New World sponsorship, and they give away vouchers to volunteers every week to go and purchase New World from their supermarket. Weet-Bix sponsor the All Blacks. I'm sure you're all aware of this and how this association really does build brand loyalty. We've got, this is just 1 year of the Weet-Bix cards, and they're not all the Weet-Bix cards we have in our family, but I have a little boy, and as soon as those cards come out, we have to buy Weet-Bix endlessly. He'll eat Weet-Bix morning, noon and night so that he can collect his full sets of cards. And so it's a very effective way of encouraging consumption of these food products. Milo, I'm sure those of you involved in junior cricket, Milo sponsored junior cricket, and that enables the sponsor to provide children directly with giveaways that are branded, things like caps, drink bottles, product samples, a whole range of things. And again, that's because I have a son who plays a lot of cricket. We've got these things all around our house, all branded. And the other sponsorship we found with a McDonald's sponsorship of football and touch rugby, where they provide Player of the Day cards to children, which include a food voucher for the children to go and redeem at the local supermarket. What we did find with the sponsorships was that the sponsorships were associated with televised sport. So televised sports have more sponsors than other sports, and I think this quote says it very nicely. Because we don't get television coverage, there's not a lot of demand for companies wanting to advertise. It's slightly different to a rugby, a netball or soccer where there's lots of television. So what we found that a lot of the sponsorship was really limited to those televised sports. And the other informants from other sports considered that the television coverage gave those sports a competitive advantage and helped them to attract sponsors. And so therefore they were able to be more successful in the sponsorship arena. Another informant said to us, yeah, I guess it's about money. I guess what we're looking for are the healthy foods, the healthy sponsors, whatever that might look like. Now that said, I'd be the first to say that if somebody came to us with a food that wasn't quite healthy but had a big checkbook, I'd probably look at the checkbook and preference. So I think money is an issue out there from the sports perspectives. Although the sports administrators were really concerned about how sponsor fit looked, and a lot of them were very, very aware of this and considered the implications of sponsorship from unhealthy food companies. And so a quote from one, for example, was that if a fast food company came to us and they offered us some reasonable money, and it was quite a good discussion, does it sit with our brand, and what would this do to the brand when you're all about healthy lifestyles, when suddenly you attach a fast food which has all these other connotations attached to it? So when we looked at the availability, what did we actually see in sports settings? And I'm sure the data I'm about to present will be of absolutely no surprise to anyone here who attends sport. So I did direct observations at rugby and netball venues, which meant I actually went to the settings and I went around and looked what was being sold and I recorded what was being sold, and then I analysed and assessed them against what was healthy and what was unhealthy. And what we found that predominantly it was unhealthy food that was available. And you can see across these settings, these rugby venues, that the red is the unhealthy foods, the green is the unclassified, that's pretty largely the coffee vendors, and the blue is the healthy foods. And in only one of these venues did we find more healthy foods than unhealthy foods. And that was in a rugby park in Auckland. And it was a slightly more advanced canteen than you see at many of the rugby venues. Sold a wide variety of food, it had yogurt, it had fruit, had a whole range of things. And the majority of the food that we saw at rugby was really things like pies, chips, deep fried hot dogs, those sorts of takeaway type foods. We saw some regional variation. There were very few sports clubs in Wellington, rugby clubs in Wellington that sold food. However, in counties Manukau, which was one of the other areas, nearly all of the rugby clubs there had some sort of, almost like a miniature takeaway bar. When we went to netball, we saw a very similar pattern, and again, the red represents the unhealthy foods, the blue is the healthy, and the green is the unclassified. So most places are selling coffee, but again, the majority of the food is unhealthy. There was quite a distinct difference that to me was really visible between netball and rugby venues, and that netball sold an awful lot of sweets, and so you'd go into netball centres and there'd be a big table with this, huge variety of sweets. You didn't see that so much at rugby, and I can't really pin it down, but it's always like boys' food. When you go to rugby, you had this sort of the solid, the pies, the burgers. When you go to netball, it was all the sweets. So it was kind of almost some difference between boys' sport and girls' sport, but can't say a lot more about that, and it was very visible. So when we talked to, I talked to a lot of club managers about the food availability in sport, and they had quite distinct views about this. Most of them were aware that the foods and drinks were energy dense and it was mainly unhealthy foods and vegetables. Most of them contracted caterers who chose what foods to provide. So they stepped aside from the issue around food in their club. They contracted a caterer, and the caterer was responsible for the food provision. Very few of the club administrators actually checked menus. Some did, but they didn't usually make any change to it. So very few of the administrators had any input to the food that was sold at clubs. At Stadia, the venue authorities were responsible for the food that was provided, and so the sports hired the stadia to play their games at, and in general the venue authorities were responsible for those provision, for that food. Most of the administrators at all levels thought caterers were entitled to profit from their sales of food, and that could only be achieved by selling junk food. If they didn't sell chips, if they didn't sell the deep fried energy dense food, they didn't think caterers could actually make a profit. There were a couple of venues where, as I said, in Manurewa, and there was one, a netball centre, where they didn't have the deep fried food and the caterers were still able to operate their business. So one assumes that if caterers operating a business, they're making a profit from it. So I'm not sure that argument really holds. But the thing that I guess was most concerning to me is that regardless of who you spoke to at whatever level, when they talked about the foods and drinks that were sold as sport, this was a normal food and drink. So when you asked a caterer, what sort of foods and drinks were you selling in your club? Oh, the normal. We sell the normal, chips, burgers, pies. So this is kind of viewed as, when we go to sport, this is the normal. And it's in direct contrast to the messages that we hear about, if you want to perform well at sport, you need to eat low-fat, healthy, nutrient-dense food. So my conclusions from this research, sponsorship doesn't associate unhealthy food and drinks with sport. High-profile televised sports are more sponsored than other sports. There are a number of sports in New Zealand who receive no sponsorship from food and beverage companies. They're the smaller sports. Marketing campaigns supporting these sponsorships likely influence food choices. Junk food is widely available in sport. As I said, no surprises to anyone here who attends a game. And that this availability undermines any effort to promote healthy eating to players and spectators, and especially to children when they go out and play a game of sport and they come off that field on a Saturday morning, they're hungry, they're tired, and they want something to eat, and what are they offered? Pie, chips, sausage in a bun. So it's certainly undermining those efforts and contrasting them. There are certainly wide opportunities to enhance food environments in almost all sports settings. I think if you took a deep fat fryer out of every sports setting, we'd actually see quite a significant change in what was available. And I think there's a place for us to have a discussion about the role of food in sport. Thank you. Anyone got any questions I'd like to ask you about that? Yeah.
You seem like you talk with the caterers. In Manurewa,
Yeah.
you have the opportunity to talk with them in relation to why they actually sort of have their balance and issues.
I didn't actually have a chance to talk to caterers. I just went out and observed what was happening, and I talked to the people in the clubs. And that was sort of what we decided to do at the start, and halfway through I realised actually the caterers would have been the people who talked to us, and why were they doing that? I think in one of the venues where there wasn't a deep fat fryer, it was that venue had actually made a decision that they didn't want a fryer in their premise. And so that meant that the caterers had to think another way to provide food, and they were able to do that, and they had a vast range of really healthy food, and people were buying it. So, there are opportunities. I guess it's part of that thing, it's just what do we think about, when we do tend to think, we'll have a sausage sizzle, or we'll have chips. It's just so normal for us to do it that sometimes I don't know if we even think about it. I don't know. I know somebody else might have some thoughts about that. Any other questions?
Yeah, as a teacher, you've got exactly the same issues as we've got in schools with school canteens.
Yeah.
Exactly the same thing. So, no news really. But
Yeah.
as soon as you get rid of the fryer, you can still make a profit.
Yeah. I think I think you're right. I think it's not just schools and sports setting, it's right across anywhere we go with food. It's a deep fat fryer, and you can make change quite simply.